Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly 10-minute fix of ancient warfare-related stuff. You can, of course, ask us a question yourself. You can send us an email. You can send us a postcard. You can send us a letter. Stop me in the street. I'm pretty obvious now with my beard. And of course, you can support us on Patreon. There's 3 levels of support. Go to patreon.com/ancient warfare podcast. And then you can back us at the level of Legionary, Optio, or Centurion. Now, I'm about to get on to today's question, which is from David. Thank you for your question, David. And it sent me down a rabbit hole, which is fine. I have no problem with rabbit holes, but, these things can be quite deep, which this one is, and expensive because I've had to go and buy books because I do like doing that. So no blame anyway. Anyway, David asks, hi guys, big fan. I was hoping Murray might be able to answer a question for me. Plutarch mentions a letter to Alexander from Anaxarchus in his Moralia. It was stated there that there were worlds innumerable and that Alexander wept as he had not even conquered a single one. Firstly, could this be the precursor to the multiverse theory? Ooh, so popular in media at the moment. Secondly, would you be able to comment on the contrast between this statement and the usual notion that Alexander wept when there were no more worlds left to conquer, as these seem to contradict one another? Thanks so much. Look forward to hearing Murray's answer. Well, there you go. Okay, so some background first. The first bit of background is, of course, Anaxarchus, who is a follower of Democritus and then accompanies Alexander basically on his expedition, but especially on his expedition to India. So we think that Anaxarchus dies in 320 BC, and the second aspect is the Moralia, or this vast set of essays by Plutarch known as the Moralia, or the moral essays. And technically speaking, the passage in question is in the De Tranquilitate Animi of Plutarch, and in chapter 4, and that translated is on the tranquility of the mind. Now, the passage in question, chapter 4 of the tranquility of the mind, Anaxarchus is speaking, so not a letter as such, but Alexander wept when he heard Anaxarchus speaking and discourse about an infinite number of worlds. And when his friends inquired what ailed him, he replied, "It is not worthy of tears," he said, that when the number of worlds is infinite, we have not yet become lords of a single one. Sorry, did I misquote that? Is it not worthy of tears? Not, it is worthy of tears. So the interesting thing about that is, firstly, there's pre-Socratic ideas about the infinite number of worlds. Secondly, yes, you could connect it to the multiverse theory, but that also connects to the pre-Socratic's philosophical idea about the multiple number of worlds, or infinite number of worlds. But from my perspective, I do wonder whether it's one of these things in ancient history where the translation has been selected. And, there are probably people out there, well, there are definitely people out there whose Greek is better than mine to be able to say, well, no, Murray, you're completely mistaken. But the Greek, going to the Greek, see, I told you it was a rabbit hole. The Greek for that infinite worlds is kosmin, from cosmos, and aperias, which means infinity, an infinity of cosmoi, I suppose. But when we go to the Greek dictionary, we find that the cosmos means orders, arrangements, decencies, good behaviors, regularities, good governments, constitution, worlds, universes, ornamentation, decorations, finery, glory, honor. So yes, indeed, you can translate it as an infinite number of worlds, but you could also translate it as an infinite number of governments, constitutions, or empires. So I wonder whether in that, and influenced by philosophy, the idea that the point is there are lots more empires beyond the ones that Alexander has conquered that were waiting for him to conquer. And that's why he wept, not infinite worlds, multiverse-like places. I'd say something like that. The other thing, of course, it reminded me of is John 11:35, Jesus wept, the shortest passage in the New Testament. Alexander wept. But it's an interesting one in the sense that I don't think it means this bigger, wider meaning that it's been given. I think it actually is probably more pragmatic that the idea that Alexander had conquered, when we think of, he's conquered the Persian Empire, he may have got to the edge where the army mutinied and basically gone, I haven't conquered this single one, that there's more of this empire for him to conquer, or more geographical terrain, geographical regions for him to conquer, divided by mountains or by rivers. So I think that it's a much more pragmatic rather than a philosophical one. Of course, you could easily argue the opposite, that it is a philosophical one, and it is a Socratic and a pre-Socratic kind of idea of multiverses and multi-universes. So you could actually argue that. Now, the other rabbit hole that this has led me down, though, and the question is, of course, that normally it's presented as Alexander wept when there were no more worlds left to conquer. And where does that come from? And that seems to contradict it, the comment in Plutarch. Now that is, I think, now again, there might be people going, no, Murray, it's from this passage. I think that comes from the very rich tradition of the Alexander romance. So, and here's where I've had to go and buy books. Not that I wasn't going to buy them anyway, but, I wanted to make sure I had them all. So you've got, of course, the Greek Alexander romance, but then it's a really diverse and rich tradition of Alexander romances in the medieval period. And some of them are incredibly influential and long-lasting. The man to read on any of that is Richard Stoneman on his explorations of that. And he's just edited a book last year on the world of Alexander after his death, which explores this in part as well. And in one of my other lives, for instance, the world of how Alexander the Great is presented in opera, endlessly fascinating. And of course, there's a medieval Alexander romance, there's an Arabic Alexander romance, and I think that the idea of Alexander weeping because there were no more worlds left to conquer actually comes from that medieval Alexander romance tradition. Now, again, there's an issue because, of course, the first Alexander romance is supposedly written by Callisthenes, who accompanied Alexander, or now known as the pseudo-Callisthenes, because we don't think it was actually Callisthenes who wrote it. And then you have things like Curtius Rufus, who are writing in the Roman Empire, but are a little bit more romantic in terms of their historical material on Alexander, as opposed to Arrian, who also is writing in the Roman Empire and is our best source for Alexander the Great, even though he's writing in the 140s, 150s, maybe even the 160s. I think he's writing the Anabasis at the very end of his publishing career, just at the time where Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus are about to launch a Parthian-Persian war of their own. I think that's when he publishes the Anabasis, because it's relevant and would get imperial readership. But there are arguments that his Anabasis, Arrian's Anabasis, comes much earlier in his literary career. Anyway, my issues there is that, of course, these are our major sources for Alexander. And at the same time, what we have is this idea of the romance, where the things accredited to Alexander are much more romantic, much more fantastical, have very little to do with history. And that gets seized upon, and by the 4th century AD, you have a sort of a proliferation of translations of the Alexander romance. We've got it translated into Coptic, Persian, Byzantine Greek, Arabic, Persian, Middle Persian and Persian, Armenian, Syriac, Hebrew, and of course it gets added to and stays being added to right through until the 15th century, 16th century. So there's all sorts of additions to this tradition. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's where the idea of Alexander wept because there were no worlds left to conquer comes from, as opposed to the original, going back to the original. Always good to go back to the original source for that, which is, of course, Anaxarchus discoursing about an infinite number of cosmoi, which I think isn't worlds, is empires, constitutions, governments. And then Alexander says he weeps, and when he's asked why he's weeping, he says to his friends, is it not worthy of tears that when the number of empires is infinite, we have not yet become lords of a single one? That's what I think. I could quite easily be persuaded on a philosophical ground that indeed he is talking about worlds, cosmoi, in the pre-Socratic multiple universes sense, and that therefore, David, in answer to that part of your question, indeed, it could be a precursor to the entire idea of the multiverse. There you go. Hope that helps and answers your question. We'll see you again soon for another Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks.